Hey, welcome back. Before we can write any code, we're going to need a text editor, so that's what we'll be installing in this video. Before we even do that, though, I want to say that we are, in this course, going to be using Visual Studio Code. I can say that the Python space is pretty well dominated by VS Code and PyCharm right at the moment, so if you use either one of those tools, it's probably a safe bet. That said, this course is going to specifically cover how to configure VS Code to work with various Python code quality tools. And so, regardless of which editor you normally use, I would recommend following along using Visual Studio Code while you take this course. If you end up finishing the course and you decide that VS Code is not the editor for you, that's totally fine. By the end of the course, you will have been exposed to the features that are typical of a professional Python software development workflow. And so basically you'll know what you're looking for in an editor, and you'll be in a good place to research those features and set them up for the editor that you'd like to work with. Having said that, let's install VS Code. To do that, let's open up a browser, and all you need to do is Google VS Code, and it should be the first thing that comes up. Their site is smart, so it will detect which operating system you're using, so I will go ahead and click this for Windows and save it somewhere. Now let's start up the installer, accept the terms. Before we continue, I just want to point out this checkbox that says add to path. Basically, what this means is in our terminal, specifically PowerShell in this case, because I'm on Windows, a VS Code command is going to be added to our path, and we'll be able to use PowerShell to launch VS Code, which is actually pretty cool. That is a feature that is also going to be available on Linux and Mac, and even on my machine, I will be using the Windows subsystem for Linux. So in all cases, we'll be able to use that code command inside of a Linux terminal. Great, it looks like the installation succeeded. I'll go ahead and launch it, and I will see you in the next video. Welcome to the next video. If you are running on a Mac or on a Linux operating system right now, like Ubuntu, then you can go ahead and skip this video. This video is going to be for Windows users, and it's going to be about setting up the Windows subsystem for Linux 2 so that Windows users can have a Linux terminal. There are emulated Linux terminals for Windows, which is different from the Windows subsystem for Linux in that it's not a true Linux operating system. But it would be a struggle to follow along with the rest of the course if you had to resort to that option. If those statements didn't make sense, sorry, let me give you some more context. Basically, most modern software is developed and especially deployed on Linux-based operating systems. Sadly, for a lot of Python tools, Windows users are kind of overlooked. A lot of common tools have poor documentation or are simply not supported on Windows. A Linux terminal is a staple of software development and is required for many of the tools that we're going to be using. So I would say if you're serious about developing Python code for production, any steps that you take to gain access to a Linux terminal is going to be a worthy investment for you. Let me explain what the Windows subsystem for Linux even is. For Windows users, there's a thing called the Windows subsystem for Linux. I may get the technical details wrong here in my explanation, but if I do, it's not that important. My understanding is that the Windows subsystem for Linux is a virtualized Linux environment. So it's like you're running two operating systems at the same time. One is Windows and then one is Linux. Those two operating systems share a file system. So when you're working on Linux, you can modify text files and images and whatnot that reside on a partition on your hard drive that the Windows machine uses. So it's almost as though you have two operating systems on one machine that have sort of a shared drive. All right, let's go ahead and try to install the Windows subsystem for Linux. To get started, I'll open up a browser and Google install WSL2. One of the first search results should be an article by Microsoft.com with the official docs to install the WSL on Windows. I found this documentation to be really helpful, so if you end up having issues with your installation, definitely refer to these. As we scroll down, we can see that they want us to use Windows PowerShell and use a command to install the Windows subsystem for Linux. Perfect, let's do it. Let's open up PowerShell by coming down to the search bar and searching for PowerShell. It should be one of the first things to come up, and then here in the menu we see we have an option to run as administrator. You'll need to click that one, otherwise the session won't have permission to install things on our machine. Note that after clicking run as administrator, you may see a shield icon down here. Click that and then click accept. Okay, so we have a PowerShell window open here. The doc said that the command was wsl-install. Before running that, I just want to confirm that WSL as a command is present on my machine. So I'll just type WSL, enter. The fact that we're seeing a lot of text output here instead of a big error message indicates that we do in fact have WSL as a command on our machine, which is a good first step. I didn't have to do anything special on my machine to have this command installed. It seems like the WSL command ships with recent builds of the Windows operating system. I'll type clear to clear my terminal. Now, before I actually run WSL install in my terminal, I want to point out a sentence that I found in the docs. It says, this command will enable the features necessary to run the WSL and install the Ubuntu distribution of Linux, which actually is what I want, but you may want to install a different distribution of Linux for yourself or a particular version of Linux. And so if you want to do that, the docs tell us that you can run WSL-list-online to see a list of available distros. So let's do that. WSL-list-online. Nice, it worked. So we can see a list here of available Linux distros and some different versions. So it looks like the default distribution is just Ubuntu. I'm not sure what version of Ubuntu that is, so I kind of want to handpick Ubuntu-20.04 for myself. If you want to use a different distribution of Linux for yourself, or maybe just a more recent version of Ubuntu, feel free to pick any of the versions that you see here. If you want to be following along exactly, you could use the same version that I'm about to install. However, I'm sure that it won't make a huge difference in your experience. Now I'll go ahead and install the Ubuntu 20.04 version for myself by typing in WSL-install-D and then the code for the distribution name, which for me is Ubuntu-20-04, and run it. And we can see it's installing. Great. I do want to allow this app to make changes to my device, and now we'll just wait a little while for it to install. Great, it looks like the install worked for me successfully, and now it's telling me to restart my computer in order for the changes to take effect. And with that, I will power down my machine. Okay, I just restarted my computer and logged in, and the first thing that popped up when I did was this Ubuntu 20.04 on Windows window, which means that it's working. I'll go ahead and skip forward until something interesting happens. Alright, it's asking me for my username now, so I'll type Eric. I would recommend that for your username, you don't use any special characters or spaces. Hopefully this prompt will stop you from doing that if you try, but I wouldn't take any chances. This username is going to become a folder name where all of the files belonging to your user in this Linux environment will be stored. Looks like I need to set a password. Okay, so halfway through typing this, I decided, wait a sec, maybe I don't want a password on this because, you know, it'd be kind of nice if every time I opened up the Windows subsystem for Linux, I didn't have to type in a password every time, because I already type in a password when I want to connect to my computer. After that, I came to my senses, so make sure you do set yourself a password, otherwise you won't have access to the sudo command, as well as some other things. I'll go ahead and follow the documentation to reset my own password, but for now, check it out. We have a working Linux terminal. Very, very exciting. Note that if we close this window, we can reopen the Windows subsystem for Linux by going back down to the search bar and searching for Ubuntu 20.04 on Windows or whichever distro you installed. Click the app and it'll open right up. If getting to this point was a challenge because of your operating system or some other error that you were facing during the installation, great job! In subsequent videos, we're going to configure this terminal and make it a great developer experience, so see you in the next few. If you have Visual Studio Code installed on your Windows operating system and you have the Windows subsystem for Linux installed, there's one step that you need to do to integrate the two of them. To show you what I'm talking about, I'll go ahead and open up Visual Studio Code. VS Code has a lot of great shortcuts that help you develop faster, and you can see some of them if you close any tabs that are up here when you first open up the editor. Here are some useful shortcuts. I won't explain any of these right now, and one that I will explain that isn't listed here is Control tilde or Control backtick. If you press Control tilde or Control backtick, we get this integrated terminal built right into VS Code. Basically, this terminal right here is a PowerShell terminal. If we click the plus button here, we could open up another terminal, and you can see over here on the sidebar we can have any number of terminals open to develop with. You can close terminals that you open by hovering over a line item and clicking the little trash can icon. Now, it's great that we have an integrated PowerShell terminal, but what we really want is a Linux terminal, and more specifically, we want a terminal that's used inside of the Windows subsystem for Linux. To set that up, I'll go over here to the sidebar, and you can see these little boxes together. If you click on this icon, this will take you to the Extensions Marketplace. One of the great things about VS Code is the fact that it has a lot of extensions, both maintained officially by Microsoft and also by the community. In the extensions search bar, we'll search for WSL, and the first one that comes up is the official WSL extension by Microsoft, so let's install that. A lot of extensions will have a blurb describing what they do. In the middle of this README, they answer the question, why do I need the WSL extension? This is a better explanation than I could give myself, so I'll just read it out loud. The Windows subsystem for Linux, which we have installed, lets you run a Linux environment, including command line tools and applications, directly on Windows, without the overhead of a traditional virtual machine or dual boot setup. Very true. The Windows subsystem for Linux especially helps web developers and those working with Bash and Linux-first tools, i.e. Ruby and Python, to use their toolchain on Windows and ensure consistency between development and production environments. Thanks for validating me, Microsoft, that production software usually is running on Linux. Now that we have the Windows subsystem for Linux VS Code extension installed, I'll show you how it works. First, I'll close out of this README. I'll go over here to this plus button and click the little drop-down arrow. Here we can see that you can choose which type of shell you run when you open up a new terminal. So I will click Ubuntu 20.04. And look at that. Just like that, we've opened up an integrated terminal in VS Code that's opened up a session in the Windows subsystem for Linux. And if we do echo $shell, we can see that the shell used in the Windows subsystem for Linux is Bash by default, which is great. But can we edit files using VS Code directly in the Windows subsystem for Linux? I'll use the command line now to create a directory inside the Windows subsystem for Linux, and then I'll show you how we can open up that folder as a workspace in Visual Studio Code. So I'll run mkdir example folder. That seems to have succeeded. Awesome. Let's do ls. The output of this command is a little chaotic, but you can see right here, example folder. So great, it was successful. I'll use cd to go inside now. And now I'll run the code command to open up the current working directory in VS Code. Look at this. VS Code's downloading a VS Code server inside of the Windows subsystem for Linux, and now we have a new window open. I'll go ahead and close out of the original window because we won't need that one anymore. If you notice down here on the bottom left, now we have this WSL:ubuntu 20.04. So this is essentially telling us that the VS Code client, which is the UI right here, this application that we're interacting with on our Windows host operating system, has established a remote connection with a VS Code server that's running inside of the Windows subsystem for Linux. Again, I'll click up here in the upper left-hand corner to open up the File Explorer. It looks like we don't have a folder that's actively opened as a workspace, and so it looks like just running the code command from the Windows host wasn't sufficient. It looks like that, while running the command from the Windows host did establish a connection to the VS Code server running in the WSL, a workspace was not actually opened up. So I'll open up an integrated terminal one more time, and if you notice, the little blue path right here that we're sitting is different than the one we were sitting in when we opened up the integrated terminal from the host OS in VS Code. If I do pwd now, we can see that the directory I'm in is home/Eric. The directory that we were in before when we created our example folder directory and then went inside was actually sitting on our Windows file system, which we see as a shared drive in the subsystem for Linux. So if I do ls, we don't actually see anything because there are no folders here. Let's create another example folder, mkdir example folder. Now we'll cd inside that one and run the code command again. Here we go. Finally, we can see that we've opened a folder inside of the WSL as a workspace in VS Code, but in the VS Code that's running on the Windows host so that we can edit it freely. And if you look here in the upper left, you can see that our workspace is called example folder, all caps. So the workspace is always called the name of the folder that you've opened up, all caps, and then it has these nice brackets telling us that we're inside of the Windows subsystem. So if I click this little page with a plus icon, we can create a file. So let's create a sample Python file that'll be empty. So we'll call it hello.py. I won't install the recommended extensions for Python just yet. We'll do that in another video. But we can try typing print hi, and there it is, a Python text file that's sitting inside of our Windows subsystem for Linux. I'll go ahead and save it. And now I'll exit out of VS Code, and I'll show you how we can get back here from scratch. Now that VS Code is closed, I'll show you how I normally open VS Code once everything's properly installed, like we have it now. Specifically, we're trying to, once again, open up the folder that we just created in the WSL, but as a workspace on our Windows host machine. I'll go back down to the search bar, and I'll actually search for the Ubuntu distribution that I installed, which is my Windows subsystem for Linux distribution. So I'll search for Ubuntu, and I'll click on it, And this opens up the Windows Subsystem for Linux terminal that we saw when we first installed the Windows Subsystem for Linux. We can see that the directory that it brought us to is the home directory again. I'll do pwd, and we can see that it's home/Eric, just like when we opened it up in VS Code. I'll do ls, and we can see example folder. And now I'll cd inside example folder. Now I'll run the code command again to open up our current directory as a VS Code workspace, but this time I'll put a dot in the command just to show you that we can use this command to open up any file or folder in VS Code, but displayed on the host Windows operating system. And there it is. We've done it. We've reopened VS Code, and we can see the same Python file that we just created. Let's open up an integrated terminal again, and I'll do ls, and we can see the very same hello.py that we created. We can do cd dot pwd, and we are back in the home directory from the integrated terminal. If you followed along as we went through this exercise, great job, and if not, good luck implementing it yourself, and I will see you in the next one. In this course, we're going to be relying pretty heavily on Git and the Git CLI. And so in this video, we're going to look at how to properly install Git and upgrade it to make sure that it's a recent version. I'm recording this video on a Windows machine, but I'll make note of how you would do this on a Mac as well as we go. Let's start out by opening a terminal. In this case, since I'm running on Windows, we'll open up the Windows Subsystem for Linux. I'll click on my Ubuntu version, and we see we have a terminal. It turned out that when I installed Ubuntu 20.04, I actually already had the git CLI command installed. So if I say git, I get a bunch of text showing that the command exists, because it's not an error. I'll run clear again, and now I want to check the version of my git CLI. So I'll run git -- version. Currently I have version 2.25.1. When I was reading articles on the internet written by people who also installed Ubuntu 20.04, in every case, they had version 2.25.1 as well. So we can see that that's the version of Git that comes by default with this Ubuntu distribution. If you're running on a Mac and you have homebrew installed, you just need to run brew install git, and you're done. You may want to run brew upgrade as well. Git is maintained in the apt-get repositories, but not often, and so if we install Git using sudo apt-get git right now, we'll install a version of Git that's still out of date. In order to install a more recent version of Git, we'll need to add a new repository so that we can download the package from there. To do that, I'll run sudo add apt repository, and then the name of the repository that contains managed Git, which is ppa:/git-core/ppa, and we'll run that. This message is encouraging. The most current stable version of Git for Ubuntu is what we want, so I'll go ahead and press enter. Now that we've added the apt-get repository that contains the most current stable version of Git for Ubuntu, we'll install it by first updating the indices of our package manager with sudo apt-get update. And then we'll install Git again by running sudo apt-get install Git. I'll clear my terminal, and let's check the Git version again. Git -- version. Now we have 2.39.1. That's 14 minor version releases greater than the last version of Git we had, so we'll take it. Before you go on to the next video, make sure that you have the Git CLI working on your machine. Good luck setting that up, and I'll see you in the next one.